perfume on his jacket, it wasn't mine. That's when it started, the little sliver of doubt. That evening, I brushed it aside, pretended it was leftover from some woman at the office. But the seed was planted. His work trip fell on the same weekend as Lisa's big reunion bash. I told him it was just girls, a little lie to let loose. We always joked about me cutting loose while he was gone. But that night felt different. The club was all lights and pounding music, and the drinks flowed too freely. Then I saw him, Jake, across the room, and for a second, it was like we were back in college. We'd always teased about something happening. The years melted away, replaced by a heat that had nothing to do with the crowded room. It's funny how a few drinks and good music can warp things. His hand on my back felt dangerous, thrilling. I shouldn't have let it go any further, but the truth is, I wanted it to. And as the taxi blurred past and we fumbled with keys at my apartment door, my common sense went up in smoke. The next few weeks were a messy tangle. My life turned into little lies, fake phone calls, excuses about running late. I was stealing moments with Jake, moments that felt electric and desperate, all fueled by the thrill of doing the wrong thing. We'd hide out in cheap cafes or even his sparse apartment, every touch and whisper tainted by a guilt that gnawed at me. The trouble was, it also felt good. I thought about Jake when I should have been thinking about my husband, about our life. I told myself it was harmless, a rebellious streak I needed to get out of my system. But that floral perfume lingered in the back of my mind. Did it linger on me, too? Each stolen moment deepened the divide. The nights I came home late, my husband's questions in his eyes, made the shame cut deeper. I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to stop, but then Jake would send a sly text, and the thrill would beat back the worry. It was a dance with the devil, and I was losing my grip on the lead. Every shared meme with Jake felt like a tiny betrayal. Work gossip morphed into conversations threaded with double meanings, jokes that only we understood. Looking over my shoulder became habit, and a jolt of panic went through me every time my husband came near while I was glued to my phone. Late night at the office again? He'd raise an eyebrow, and the words sounded more suspicious each time. I'd mumble an excuse under my breath, my stomach twisting. I started inventing fake calls with old friends just to explain why I was glued to the damn screen. Then came the stolen lunches. Our thing. The rush of getting out of the office. The thrill of sitting side by side in tucked away cafes no one would recognize. I began to learn new things about Jake, his favorite sandwich order, a nervous habit of drumming his fingers, and his touch. It wasn't just lust anymore. It was an undercurrent of something deeper, something terrifying. The first time I went to his apartment, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. It wasn't fancy, just plain white walls and sparse furniture. But within those walls, everything felt intensified. The forbidden aspect of it only seemed to heighten the passion, the guilt. Walking back into my own house afterward, every familiar object felt like an accusation. The tie my husband had tossed carelessly on the chair seemed to burn my eyes, whispering the word, betrayal, over and over. The lies, the stolen hours, the fading scent of his cologne on my skin. It all pressed down, suffocating me. Each day blended into the next. Routine mornings pretending all was normal. Frantic lunch breaks fueled by desire. And those empty evenings echoing with unspoken guilt. Every text was a fire I couldn't put out. Every whispered word with another man was a hammer blow against the foundation of my marriage. I was falling apart, even as I fell deeper for Jake. And I knew, deep down, it was only a matter of time until it all came crashing down. I started seeing threats everywhere. A lingered glance at the grocery store, an overheard whisper in the office. Felt like the whole world was in on my secret, waiting for me to slip up. Ordinary moments turned into a minefield of potential exposure. The lies got heavier too. Elaborate excuses about work projects. Phantom calls from old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I looked at myself in the mirror and was shocked by the stranger staring back. Hollow eyes. A smile that looked painted on. I was living a double life, split down the middle with no way to heal the crack. And yet, the pull toward Jake didn't ease. Every shared look, every touch, it was fire, and I was drawn to it like a moth, regardless of the consequences. It disgusted me how much I wanted it, craved it. But the shame, the guilt, was a constant shadow. Walks home were leaden, each step reminding me of how far I'd strayed. I'd pass shops we frequented together, the familiar ache of betrayal twisting in my gut. And when I finally got home, our wedding photo seemed like a slap in the face. One night, I finally gave in, turned a face down on the dresser, a pathetic act of defiance. Worst of all were the evenings with my husband. The chasm between us yawned wider with each strained conversation. He'd try to crack a joke, and it would fall flat, disappearing into the awkward silence. My attempts to sound normal felt forced, hollow. Every bite of dinner tasted like deceit, and I was choking on it. He wasn't stupid, that much I knew. I saw growing suspicion cloud his eyes, but I didn't know if it was about Jake, or just the slow disintegration of everything we built. The not knowing, the waiting for the other shoe to drop, made me feel like I was going insane. I was trapped by my own deceit, a knot of lies twisting tighter with every passing day. His eyes lingered on my phone screen too long one morning, a spark of suspicion dimming their usual warmth. It was like a lit fuse, and I snapped before I could think. A petty argument about something stupid flared into a mess of angry words, accusations I barely even understood myself. There was no stopping it, the pent-up guilt bubbling over into rage I couldn't control. He didn't fight back, which was even worse. He just sat there, picking at his food. He used to love this meal, but now he pushed the food around his plate, eyes downcast. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and I was the conductor. Then came the change. The late-night walks. He'd come back hours later, a distant look in his eyes, like he'd been battling something I couldn't see. At first, a flicker of perverse relief washed over me. Was he finally on to someone else? A taste of his own medicine? But the relief curdled into something bitter. Was he even thinking of me anymore? Or was our marriage just a shadow he was starting to walk right through? Then that damn text. It popped up during a routine staff meeting, Jake's name flashing across the screen. Can't stop thinking about you. Panic twisted with a dark pleasure inside me. I deleted it fast, fingers shaking, but the echo of those words wouldn't leave. They wormed their way into my thoughts, a forbidden mantra. The days became a blur of fear and adrenaline. Work was a torture chamber where every ring of my phone was a potential disaster. Home was no better. The silences stretched into chasms, filled with suspicion and the ghost of what we used to have. I was a wreck. One part of me screamed to confess, to rip the bandage off and just face whatever came next. The other part, that part was still hooked on the high-wire rush of keeping my secret, desperate for one more fix of Jake before I finally crashed and burned. I was a goddamn mess, and the worst part was, I knew exactly who to blame. The doorbell shattered my fragile peace. There stood my husband, a smile on his face and a small, neatly wrapped box in his hands. "Happy birthday," he said, his eyes hopeful just like they used to be. As I unwrapped the gift, guilt pierced me. A beautiful necklace, chosen with care. It shimmered on my neck, feeling more like a noose with every passing second. This man, who loved me, had no idea how deeply I'd betrayed his trust. Worse was to follow. "Surprise," he announced. "I booked us a weekend getaway. Remember that place we honeymooned?" I figured it was time for some romance. My world seemed to tilt on its axis. That hotel where we'd started our life together was now a loaded weapon. Each smile he gave sent a fresh wave of shame crashing over me. I couldn't bring myself to tell him no. "We need to stop," I texted Jake later that day. There was no question I had to try. But before the message could even send, his reply came, "No. I'm coming over." A desperate back and forth ensued. Me pleading to end it, him insistent. Then, his voice on the line, rough and laced with a need that mirrored my own. I almost caved, but as I hung up, the thought of my husband, so excited about our trip, sliced into me. The weekend was torture. We played at being us again, but every forced smile, every stolen glance in the direction of my phone, felt like a fresh cut. In our honeymoon suite, with its echoes of happier times, Any lingering desire turned to ash. I couldn't look my husband in the eye, knowing with each touch, it wasn't him I was thinking about. The drive home was pure agony. I kept replaying the weekend, every lie, every fake laugh. He chatted about his week, oblivious, while on the brink of shattering it all. The confession bubbled in my throat, but something held me back. Cowardice? Or a desperate hope that I could bury this mess deep enough and it might disappear. After the disastrous weekend, life became a strange blur. The normalcy of grocery runs or making dinner felt like a cruel charade. My secret pressed down on me, suffocating. The air in our house seemed stale with unspoken accusations. I'd wake from nightmares, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. The warmth of my husband's body next to mine a strange, unwelcome comfort. One afternoon at the supermarket, the same damn floral perfume hit me like a punch. My heart pounded as I spotted a woman browsing the wine aisle. Could it be her? The woman from Jake's office? I ducked behind a display of cereal boxes, holding my breath until she passed. Paranoia was my new best friend. Every text from Jake was a time bomb. Today it said, "Just got your favorite flowers." My blood ran cold. Was this a gesture of sweetness or a twisted trap? Did he know my husband was trying to win me back? One evening, after pretending to work late, I found myself parked outside Jake's building. I just wanted a glimpse of him, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, besides this bone-deep exhaustion. I should have driven away, but instead, my feet led me to his door. "I have to talk to you." I choked out the words before I could change my mind. "I can't do this anymore, Jake, I can't." His eyes widened in surprise. His hand brushed mine, sending a jolt of treacherous electricity down my arm. Was this the end? Or a horrifying new beginning? I couldn't decide which was worse. All I knew was that I'd set off an explosion, and there was no telling who'd get caught in the blast. My legs felt like stone as I navigated those echoing stairs, each step towards Jake's door heavyweight against the knot in my stomach. The knock on his door hung in the air. One knock, then another, fueled by a mix of desperation and dread. When the door creaked open, my heart leapt. But it wasn't Jake. A woman stood there, late 30s maybe, hair haphazardly tied back, a touch of defiance in her eyes. She stared at me, a flicker of curiosity sparking in her gaze. "I see you're Alex here?" My voice came out as a whisper, the wrong name catching in my throat. It was meant to be Jake. Jake who was supposed to answer that door. She let out a bitter laugh. "Alex? Moved out weeks ago. Guess you haven't been around much lately. Have you? You his wife, darling?" The word wifey hummed in the air, accusatory and mocking. My vision blurred as the bottom dropped out of my world. He'd lied, not just to me, not just about us, about everything. I fumbled for something to say, but the words wouldn't come. The woman in the doorway watched my meltdown with a mix of pity and scorn. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that hallway, a swirl of shock and betrayal threatening to pull me under. Finally, I turned. Each step away was a step into a whole new nightmare. Had Jake been playing me this whole time? Had our whole stolen affair been some sick joke to him? Was I the fling, the disposable one left behind when he moved on? Anger ignited beneath the humiliation, pushing me forward. I raced down the stairs, a broken sob escaping me. In the half-light of the parking lot, I fumbled for my phone, tears blurring the screen. There was only one thing I could do, one person who deserved the raw, ugly truth. My fingers trembled as I hit my husband's number. It was time I stopped running, it was time for him to know. The woman's bitter words echoed in my head like nails in a coffin. Moved out, was this all a sick game? My fingers shook as I got into my car. The drive home blurred into streaks of headlights and tears, the world warping around my burning humiliation. Stumbling into our house felt like walking into a funeral. Every picture, every carefully chosen knickknack seemed to taunt me. Our reflection in the hallway mirror warped into something hideous. The pathetic, broken wife, her hair disheveled, eyes red-rimmed. Before I could stop myself, my fist struck the mirror. It shattered with a satisfying crack, mirroring the fractured mess inside me. His coffee mug, the one with the silly inside joke, sat innocently on the kitchen counter. A white-hot rage coursed through me. With a scream, I hurled the mug against the wall. It exploded in a shower of ceramic, the noise echoing the explosive collapse of my own carefully constructed lies. Then, amidst the shards, his phone. It was like a weapon lying in wait, an irresistible, dangerous impulse. I grabbed it, fingers trembling. I'd never done this before, invaded his privacy that way. But after everything, didn't I deserve to know? Didn't I deserve something? The screen lit up with the swipe of my thumb, and I braced myself. Texts with colleagues, boring work updates, then a photo. My throat tightened. It was him with a woman, smiling at a beach I'd never seen. Her name sent a bolt of lightning down my spine. Sarah. Quiet, efficient Sarah from accounting, the one I hadn't even considered a threat. The irony cut like a knife. Betrayal was a cruel boomerang, and now I was the one bleeding. I didn't know if I was furious at finding his new happiness or at the utter demolition of my pathetic, fragile hope that Jake meant something real. Maybe I was just angry at myself, and at the broken woman I'd become. My fingers gripped his phone so tightly I thought it might crack. Sarah. That name kept stabbing at me, twisting the knife already lodged in my gut. All those office jokes, those shared lunches, were they shared with her too? Had everyone been laughing at me behind my back? The bile rose in my throat, a bitter mix of rage and shame. I swiped through the messages, hoping for a confession, some incriminating evidence. But there was nothing, just boring office stuff, coordination for an upcoming project. Yet, the picture of them, him grinning with his arm around Sarah, told a story of its own. That beach looked so far away, a world where I'd never existed. A wave of nausea crashed over me, a delayed shock that threatened to buckle my knees. Then, the sound that snapped me back to the present, his footsteps on the stairs. My breath caught in my chest, a panicked animal in a trap. What would I say? What could I say? He came through the door, surprised smile fading as he noticed the mess. Whoa, what happened here? He eyed the shattered mug, weariness creeping into his voice. I opened my mouth, but then it was too late. Every lie, every excuse I'd concocted, seemed to vanish. All I could do was look at him, and the understanding in his eyes was somehow worse than any accusation. The air between us thickened with unspoken truths, stretching and snapping like an over-tightened wire. He didn't have to say a word. We both knew, finally, that everything was over. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I know. It felt like a confession dragged from some deep, forbidden corner of my soul. He went still, his face draining of color. The takeout bags hit the ground with a muffled thud, the only sound in that horrible, stretched-out silence. I watched his eyes search mine, a flicker of desperation warring with cold comprehension. An eternity passed. He waited for me to continue, for me to tear open the wound further. But the words refused to come. How could I begin to explain the trail of lies, the betrayal? With a step, then another, he moved towards me. There was a darkness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, his usual gentle warmth replaced by something sharp and wounded. How long? His voice was a hoarse whisper, laced with the raw edge of his own pain. It mirrored the agony twisting in my gut. Suddenly he seemed older, a stranger in the man I thought I knew. The air between us was thick with accusations. For his own secret happiness, for my shameful deception. Yet, a twisted relief washed over me. It was out there, the truth we'd both tiptoed around. There was a terrible kind of freedom in the devastation, in this long overdue moment of reckoning. I didn't answer his question. I didn't know if I even could. All I knew was that this moment, this shared desolation, was where it all ended. Our marriage, built on affection and habit, had just shattered into pieces too small to repair. The only question remaining was how much. I met my wife a few years ago at a hospital where I went to visit my friend's wife, who just gave birth. Coincidentally, she came in at the same time, but because my friend's wife was asleep, we had to wait in the lobby for about 40 minutes to an hour before she woke up. People who know me well know I am very extroverted and I talk to strangers a lot. While waiting, I tried making jokes with the nurses at the reception desk, But they weren't having it, so I went back to sit with my wife. I tried my best to keep my mouth shut, but we could tell that the silence was awkward, and the moment I started talking, we both busted into a loud laugh. I didn't know she had been observing me. She knew I would try to talk to her. From there, we talked for almost an hour until a nurse came to tell us my friend's wife was awake, and we both went in to see her and her baby. As much as I would love to mention my wife's name, so the people out there can stay away from her, I'd love to keep this anonymous in case any of our friends stumbles on this story. Before we left the hospital that day, I got my wife's number and we started talking. I also followed her on Facebook, and we chatted there all the time. She was gorgeous, and I loved almost everything about her. As of the time we met, she was working at a veterinary shop, and I worked for a construction company. We used to hang out whenever we were free since we were both single and slowly grew fond of each other. One of the reasons I loved my wife was that she was always seeking new ways to improve herself. She read self-help books all the time and listened to all of those personal development podcasts and the rest. Honestly, she also helped me build the habits of reading books and trying to become better, and it made me glad to have a partner who cared about my growth. Fast forward to some months later, we got so close, and we always told each other about what during work. Even without meeting my colleagues at work, she knew their names, roles, and everything that happened during work hours. The same applied to me. I knew everyone's name in the vet clinic she worked at, including the names of the animals that came in daily and those that returned. I was sure she was the one for me at that point, and I asked her out. When she said yes, I asked her to move in with me so we could begin to plan our lives and future together, and she did. She moved in with me and we became a super couple. I loved her so much that I did everything for her. In fact, I didn't let her contribute to paying rent because I felt it was my responsibility to take care of her. I bought her whatever she wanted, and we went on many fancy dates together. Before I met my wife, I had been in 3 different relationships, but they all cheated on me, and none of my exes cared about me like my wife did, so I believe she was the one for me. In less than 3 months of dating, I met her family and she met mine too. Our families knew we were dating each other, and we were pretty serious too. So, after 10 months of dating and living with each other, I asked her to marry me and she said yes. Before we got married, we both agreed we would have kids after 3 years of being married, so we could spend time with each other, do the things we loved, and not have to put our lives on hold. Then most importantly, we would have saved enough money to give our children a comfortable life. A year after we got married, nothing changed, and everything was still beautiful and blissful, like when we were still dating. But things began to change between us after we celebrated our 2nd-year anniversary. My wife began to show less interest in the things she used to love, including our 2nd anniversary, which she used to look forward to, and that's when I began to suspect that something was wrong. It all started with her obsession with personal development, and she claimed she found this new mentor online. A man in his late 30s who she asked to mentor her for a fee, and he agreed. According to my wife, this man was a life coach, and he had mentored many people in the past and helped them build their lives. At first, I didn't have an issue with her having a mentor, because I knew she wouldn't back down or change her mind until she got what she wanted, so I allowed her to do her thing. However, a couple of weeks after she started her mentorship classes with him, I noticed they were getting closer and closer, and I kept feeling that something was off between them, but I shook it off. It wasn't enough that I was paying for the mentorship hourly, but she always came up with new excuses for me to pay for things I didn't understand. She met with her mentor almost every week, and even had to cancel most of our lunch dates to be with him. Then, as if that wasn't enough, whenever I came home from work, I'd have to eat my dinner alone, watch television alone, and go to bed, because she would talk to him for hours on the phone without spending time with me. I complained about it, but she said I was making a mountain out of a molehill, so I let it slide, expecting that she would change, but it got worse. Once, we were supposed to go to my parents' house for my dad's 62nd birthday, but she didn't show up and refused to take my calls. That evening, when I returned home, I met her and her mentor having dinner in her home, and I was so mad. When she saw me, she smiled and acted like everything was fine. It even made me madder when I found out she forgot about her JaVale's birthday, even after I reminded her that morning. The craziest part was that we had not had dinner as a couple for weeks, and she even stopped cooking, but there she was, eating and laughing with her mentor. I got so mad and yelled at her Then I asked her mentor to leave, but she stood up and started challenging me in front of her mentor. She said he had taught her a lot of things, and he could not leave, so I had to choose between joining them for dinner or doing something else. I was so furious that I left the house and returned to spend the night at my parents' house. That night, I stayed awake close to my phone, hoping she would call and beg me, but she didn't, and that was when I was forced to look up her mentor online. To my greatest surprise, I spent hours digging and could not find anything related to mentorship or personal development about him. When I was frustrated at finding nothing, I hired a private investigator to investigate him. Weeks after digging, the PI I hired discovered he was a convicted felon and a master manipulator with arrest warrants. I could not even believe it. The PI could not find anything related to mentorship with him, and that's when I realized that my wife had been playing me for months. She was getting money from me and giving it to her lover as his payment while I worked my ass off to give her a better life. I collected all the evidence from my PI and paid him off. The next day, I went home early so I could meet my wife at home and show her all of the evidence, but I caught them doing it on my couch and I was enraged. I hit him before I threw the evidence on the table, and my wife did not look surprised. It was an indication that she knew everything about him. She then started begging for forgiveness and asked me not to say anything. I told them I had contacted the police and she should go ahead and marry her lover and rot in jail for all I care. While I was yelling at them, the police arrived at my house and took him away. Immediately he was taken away. She went on her knees and began to beg me. She said he manipulated her, but since he was out of the picture, we could return to how we were. Hearing that made me madder, so I kicked her out and called her parents to let them know their daughter would be coming home soon, and we weren't together anymore. Months later, we divorced and we went our separate ways. Until the last 6 months, she kept calling me with different numbers, until I warned her that we could never be together, even if it were in her next life. Of course, I miss her, but being single is way better than living with a cheating spouse. Even the last few months of our marriage were hell for me, so I'm glad I made the right decision. OP, I wonder why you didn't look up your wife's mentor before she started her mentorship classes. That was carelessness on your own part. It's just terrible that she played you and manipulated you to pay for classes that did not exist. Although it's hard, you made the right decision by kicking her out of your house and divorcing her. Such a woman does not deserve second chances because she would have cheated on you again, even if you forgave her. It's even more disturbing that she didn't show any remorse when you showed her the pieces of evidence. But most importantly, she is no longer in your life. Thank you for sharing with us. Now let's get into our second story for today. My wife and I fell apart after 2 years of marriage. My wife and I started dating around 2020 after the coronavirus struck the world. She had lost her family of 3 to the virus, and as her closest family friend, I had no other option than to take her in. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. One was my bedroom and the other was my office because I was already working remotely for a top freelancing platform whose name I would be withholding, and I had to move my office to my bedroom so she could sleep in the second room. When she moved in, she was grieving, always moody, and almost depressed, and I took up the responsibility of caring for her all through her stay with me. At that time, I was earning very well, so I didn't need her to contribute to anything, not even groceries. She barely ate and was not herself for the first few months. 7 months later, she snapped out of her morning state and became active again. Then she started looking for a job. The main reason she wanted a job was to pay me back for all the things I had done for her, but when I found out, I stopped her from working and suggested that she learn a high-demand skill so she could register on the same platform I worked at and also earn remotely. She agreed and I paid for an expensive course for her and she mastered the skill. In the following months, she registered on the platform and began to get her own clients, and that was how we became 2 remote workers living together. When my wife moved in with me after she lost her parents, I had just broken up from a toxic relationship, and the last thing I wanted was a relationship. But having my wife in the house all the time helped me in some way and caused me to reevaluate the important things in life. So, in the process of her living with me, I fell in love with her even without knowing. With her becoming active again, our relationship grew stronger, and we even became closer. I literally became her only friend and family, and slowly we started doing the things only couples did. We went on vacations together because we were both financially stable, got each other gifts, visited the places we always wanted to, and we even took more advanced courses to help us in our skills. After living together for 2 years, the neighbors and those who stayed or worked around our house knew we were together, even when I had not asked her out yet. I knew she loved me, but I was afraid she would turn me down because she kept saying she was tired of people coming into her life and leaving her when she needed them the most. So I kept procrastinating. Eventually, I asked her out on her 27th birthday. We weren't doing anything that year, we only went to have a fancy dinner, and while we were in the restaurant, I paid the waiter to bring in a cake I had delivered some hours before we went there, and instead of having happy birthday, it had will you be my girlfriend, and she said yes in excitement. Initially, I intended to propose to her, but I wanted to ask her out first. For months later, after she said yes to me, I asked her to marry me and she said yes. My parents already knew her because her late family and my family were friends, and they were delighted when they found out we were getting married. We made the wedding plans and had a small wedding, then moved into a bigger apartment with enough space for our respective workspace. When we moved into this new apartment, my wife was jovial and always in high spirits with the neighbors. The neighbors, too, were receptive and welcoming, unlike my former neighbors, who were always busy and barely had time to speak or talk with us for more than 5 minutes. When this happened, I was delighted because she had a different happiness spending time with the neighbors, especially since she lost her family and barely interacted with others except my family and me. She even started cooking and sharing food with the neighbors and their kids, and it contributed to their closeness. Being remote workers allowed us to create our own work timetable, and whenever she was done working, she would go grocery shopping and come back home to cook. She claimed that cooking helped her clear her head, and sharing food with other people reminded her of her family reunions and much more. I understood her point of view, so I didn't argue with her or try to stop her, even when some of the neighbors started taking advantage of her kind gesture. Aside from the food, some neighbors began to ask for financial assistance, which we helped whenever we could, and there was this 80-year-old man who asked if she could help him cook on some evenings and clean his house too, since he had no family living with him. So when my wife told me about it, I reluctantly agreed, and she'd go over to his house twice or thrice a week to cook and clean. About a month after she started cooking and cleaning for him, I noticed she went there almost every evening except on weekends. This was more often than their initial agreement, but I thought everything was okay. Then one day, I was in my apartment watching television when I heard a knock on the door. I knew it was unlike my wife to knock when she had her keys. So I opened the door and realized it was our neighbor she cooked for. When I saw him, I thought he had come to thank me and my wife for her help, but he looked somewhat disturbed. When he sat and I asked him if everything was okay, he first said, "Son, I want your wife to stop coming over to my house because she is having an affair with my renter." Then he stopped and looked at me. I was shocked to hear that and didn't know what to say. I asked him if he was telling the truth, and he admitted that he had no reason to lie. When we were having this discussion in my apartment, my wife had gone grocery shopping to cook the next day, so she wasn't at home. I didn't want to believe the old man, but like he said, he had no reason to lie, and it made no sense for him to lie against my wife. So in the end, I asked him if he could show me something to prove that he was telling the truth, and he promised to make a video and send it to me when next she came over, which would be her last time visiting his house. That evening, when my wife came back, I didn't mention anything to her. I just acted like everything was fine, and I didn't say that the old man came over when she was away. The next evening, she told me she was going there as usual, and I pretended to not pay any attention and acted like I was engrossed with my work. About 15 minutes after she left, the old man sent me a video of my wife in his renter's room, and they were making out in the living room, thinking he was asleep in his room. When I saw the video, I was broken. I knew the man she was kissing and could not believe she had done that to me. I thanked him and told him I'd be locking her out of the house, and he promised to do the same because his renter was late on rent payment and he had enough of him. Later that evening, when my wife came home and could not access the house, she started to yell and hit the door, but I sent her the same video, and she began to beg me from outside. She asked me to open the door to discuss things, but I was done with her. She betrayed me and did not care about my feelings. On the other end, her lover was kicked out by the old man, and they were both homeless that evening. I refused to let her in that night, and after a few days, she returned to meet her stuff packed at one corner of the house, but she refused to leave. I called the police because she was disturbing my peace and the neighbor's peace, and she was taken away. About 2 months later, I divorced her, and she cried bitterly. She tried to emotionally blackmail me into staying with her, but I had enough of her nonsense. She said something about me being the only person she had left in the world, but I reminded her she had her lover now, and I cut all ties with her. It turned out that her lover was an illegal immigrant, and he fled the country when I threatened to arrest him on the day my wife came to pick up her things. So in the end, he left her, and she had no one else to turn to. It's been a couple of months, and I still feel stupid for being played like that, but I'm way better now, and I don't think I'll be ready to be in a relationship anytime soon. OP, you ended up with bad people in the past, and they took your love for granted. You should even be glad that your wife eventually showed her true colors early in the marriage and didn't lead you on for years. It would have been more heartbreaking with time. Consider yourself lucky to have a nice neighbor who could not watch your wife cheat on you. I know you did a lot for her, but this has nothing to do with you being at fault. I'm glad you made the right decision. Wish you all the best going forward. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts.